Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the world of Anselm of Canterbury. You know,
11th century.
yeah, 11th century philosopher and theologian Anselm of Canterbury. Um, and you wanted to explore this guy. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our source today.
Sounds good.
Anselm is known for his idea of faith-seeking understanding.
Right.
And for a philosopher,
Yeah,
that really hits home, doesn't it?
it absolutely does. I think for Anselm, this wasn't about ditching faith for pure logic.
Right.
It was more about using reason to kind of dig deeper into what we already believe in. It's like this dynamic interplay.
Yeah, like that, a dynamic relationship between the two.
Yeah, where faith is the driver,
Yeah.
and then understanding is kind of the goal.
I like that. And Anselm really applied this to some pretty big questions.
Mm-hmm.
Can you logically prove that God exists?
Right.
What does it really mean for God to be all-powerful and all-knowing?
Yeah.
And we get this. If we're free, why do we sin?
Like,
Big questions.
big questions.
Anselm had some surprising answers.
Yeah.
Especially to that last one.
Yeah.
But to really get into his arguments, I think it helps to know a little bit about his life.
Okay.
Born in 1033, he eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury,
Well.
but not before spending years at this Benedictine Abbey of Bec,
Okay.
which is like a real intellectual hub.
So he wasn't just some like ivory tower theologian.
Exactly.
They had,
Yeah, he was in the world.
real world experience, and he was navigating,
Right.
some pretty serious political turmoil
Oh, yeah.
during his time, and still producing these
While writing these groundbreaking
philosophical works.
philosophical works.
Yeah.
So, imagine
Yeah.
leading the church, dealing with kings like William Rufus,
Oh, yeah.
Henry
Yeah.
I,
Right.
who were notorious for kind of challenging the church's authority.
And yet he still had the time and energy to write things like the monologian, the proslogian, and those 4 intense dialogues.
Yeah. Talk about dedication.
Serious dedication.
But not to mention,
Right. 11th century.
11th century. No internet.
No internet.
No espresso machines.
Exactly.
It's
impressive.
How did he do all that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm particularly interested in these theistic proofs.
Mm-hmm.
Anselm was really determined to show that belief in God
Yeah.
was rationally sound,
Mm-hmm.
going beyond faith alone.
That's where the monologian comes in.
Okay.
He very meticulously lays out arguments about the supremely good
Yeah.
and supremely great being step by logical step.
Right.
It's like a philosophical blueprint for understanding God's existence.
Okay, so he's building a case.
He's building a case.
Okay, but then in the proslogian, he goes for it
Yeah.
with his famous ontological argument.
The ontological argument.
Now, I've studied this,
Mm-hmm.
but it still makes my head spin,
Right.
right? Could you maybe walk us through it?
Yeah.
As if you were explaining it to
Okay.
a fellow philosopher.
All right.
A
Let's stick.
little skeptical.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy.
Okay.
So Anselm's argument hinges on this concept of that then, which nothing greater can be thought.
Right.
And he starts by saying
Okay.
that we can all conceive of such a being,
Okay.
right? And this being would possess all perfections
Okay.
to the highest degree.
So far, so good.
All right, good. So then Anselm argues that existence itself is a perfection.
Okay.
It's better to exist than to not exist, right? So if this greatest conceivable being only existed in our minds,
Right.
then we could imagine something even greater,
Okay.
namely that same being
Yeah.
existing in reality.
Ah, I see. So the very concept of this being
Right.
demands its existence.
That's its existence.
Otherwise,
Otherwise, it wouldn't be.
it wouldn't truly be that than which nothing greater can be thought.
Exactly. And some saw this as a logical necessity. Of course, this argument has been debated for centuries.
Right.
One of the most famous objections comes from Ganilo,
Oh, yeah.
another monk,
Right.
who raised this lost island argument.
Right. The Lost Island argument.
Yeah, essentially. Where he says,
He says if Anselm's logic works for God,
right,
why not for anything?
right, can we just prove the existence of a perfect island just by conceiving of it?
Exactly.
Right.
It's a clever counterargument.
Yeah.
And it gets at the heart of the debate about
Right.
the nature of existence and
Yeah.
conceivability.
Now, interestingly, Anselm didn't directly address the lost island in his response.
He did not.
He claimed that Ganilo had misunderstood
Mm-hmm.
his argument.
Yeah.
So he sidestepped the island.
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
So Anselm's point was that his argument didn't depend on this general principle
Okay.
that something is greater
Right.
if it exists in reality rather than in the mind,
Right.
which is kind of the principle
Yeah.
Guadagnino uses? Okay, so he's drawing a distinction.
He's drawing a distinction.
Okay, but then what is his argument?
So Anselm insisted that his point boiled down to this.
Okay.
First, that than which a greater cannot be thought, can be thought.
Right.
Second, if it can be thought, it must exist in reality.
Okay.
Therefore, it exists.
I see. So he's linking conceivability with actual existence
Yes.
in a very specific way,
In a very specific way.
applied only to this ultimate being.
Right.
But even if we grant him that first premise,
Yeah,
that second one still seems like a leap.
it does.
How does he justify
Right.
claiming that if something can be thought, it must exist?
Well, Anselm's answer kind of hinges on the unique characteristics
Okay.
of that than which nothing greater can be thought.
Okay.
He argues that this being must have certain qualities
Okay.
that a merely possible but non-existent entity
Right.
couldn't have.
Okay.
For example, he says that a being capable of not existing
Got
is
it.
less great than a being that exists necessarily.
Okay.
So if the greatest conceivable being could fail to exist,
Yeah.
it wouldn't actually be the greatest.
That's a fascinating,
Incredible.
challenging
Yeah.
line of reasoning.
It's a head scratcher.
He's essentially claiming that existence is part of the definition
Right.
of this supreme being.
Yes.
It's a bold move.
Very bold.
And as you said, it sparks centuries
Centuries.
of philosophical debate.
And they continue to this day.
Yeah, and they continue.
But even if you disagree with Anselm's logic,
Right.
his ontological argument remains a testament to his intellectual daring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's say, for the sake of argument,
Okay.
that we accept this premise.
Right.
What does Anselm then say about the nature of this God,
Yeah.
whose existence he claims to have proven?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
And perhaps even more challenging for the
Oh.
philosophical mind.
Well, before we dive into that,
Okay.
let's take a quick break.
Sounds good.
We'll be back in just a moment to explore the rest of Anselm's thought-provoking ideas.
All right, so picking up where we left off, once Anselm lays out his argument for God's existence, he turns to exploring the attributes of this God. He uses that idea of that than which nothing greater can be thought, almost like a yardstick to measure what characteristics this being must have.
Right. It's like he's saying, okay, if we've established this ultimate being exists, what else can we know about it based on its very nature?
Exactly. And he comes up with this fascinating list of attributes: omnipotence,
Yeah.
justice, impassibility, meaning God can't suffer timelessness, and more. For our dive today, let's focus on three that I think are particularly thought-provoking
Okay.
for the philosophical mind:
Okay.
impassibility, timelessness, and simplicity.
Those are definitely big ones. Let's start with impassibility. Now, to a modern sensibility, the idea that God wouldn't experience emotions might seem, well, a bit cold. Why would a God who can't feel be considered greater than one who can?
Anselm's view on this is deeply rooted in the philosophical tradition he inherited, particularly from Augustine and ultimately Plato. They emphasize the idea that true perfection is unchanging and eternal. Emotions by their very nature are fleeting and changeable.
So a God who experiences joy, sorrow, anger would be seen as less perfect because those emotions are temporary.
Precisely. Anselm believed that a God unaffected by the ebb and flow of emotions, a God who is purely active rather than passive, is therefore more perfect and greater.
I can see how that fits into a certain philosophical framework, but it definitely raises some questions. How do you reconcile a God who can't feel with the idea of a God who loves? Is love not an emotion?
That's a crucial question, and one that Anselm wrestled with. He argues that God's love is not an emotion in the human sense, but rather an unchangeable, active willing of the good for the beloved. It's an expression of his perfect and unchanging nature.
Okay, so it's a different kind of love, a love that transcends our human understanding of it. Interesting. Now, how about timelessness? That one always bends my brain a bit.
It's a real head-scratcher. Anselm argued that God exists outside of time altogether. He's not simply everlasting, but completely unbound by the constraints of past, present, and future.
But if that's true, how can God interact with our world? How does prayer work? What about miracles? It all seems a bit paradoxical.
It is a paradox, and it's a question that has challenged philosophers and theologians for centuries. Anselm's argument stems from the idea that time is a limitation. If God is bound by time, then he's not truly all-powerful. By placing God outside of time, Anselm elevates him to a higher plane of existence.
It's about emphasizing God's ultimate power and transcendence.
Exactly, but it also raises profound questions about how we understand God's actions in the world. If God is timeless, does that mean he sees all of time at once? Does he know the future? And if so, What does that mean for our free will?
Those are huge questions. And I don't think Anselm gives us easy answers, but I can see how a philosopher like him would be drawn to the intellectual challenge of exploring these concepts.
Absolutely. Now, the idea of timelessness also connects to another attribute. Anselm ascribes to God simplicity. He believed God has no parts whatsoever. He's not made up of components or divisible in any way.
Now, why would that be considered a good thing? Why is it greater to be partless? It seems counterintuitive.
For Anselm, simplicity is about ultimate unity and perfection. Anything with parts can be broken down, separated, or changed. God, as the source of all being, must be utterly simple and indivisible.
So it's about emphasizing God's absolute oneness and immutability.
Yes, he even argues that anything composed of parts is less than fully one because it can at least theoretically be broken down. God, on the other hand, is the ultimate unbreakable unity. And if God is timeless, as Anselm argues, it follows that he can't be composed of temporal parts, which would place him within time rather than outside of it.
I see the connection. It's all about upholding God's absolute perfection and transcendence. But I'm curious, how does Anselm reconcile all these attributes? Some of them seem like they could contradict each other. Like, how can God be both perfectly just and merciful? If he's just, shouldn't he punish wrongdoing? But if he's merciful, shouldn't he forgive?
Yeah.
How do those two impulses work together?
You've hit on a classic theological dilemma, and Anselm doesn't shy away from it. He acknowledges the apparent tension between justice and mercy.
So how does he resolve it? Does he just say, well, God's mysterious, so we can't fully understand?
He does acknowledge an element of mystery, but he also tries to demonstrate how these attributes can coexist. He argues that God's omnipotence, for example, doesn't mean he can do literally anything. It means he has unlimited power within the bounds of what is logically possible and consistent with his own nature. Since lying or acting unjustly is contrary to God's nature, those actions are outside the scope of his omnipotence.
So it's not that God can't do those things, but rather that he wouldn't because they go against his very being.
Exactly. And he applies a similar logic to justice and mercy. He argues that God's justice isn't simply about punishing the wicked, it's about acting in a way that's fitting for his supreme goodness, which includes mercy.
So mercy becomes an expression of God's goodness, which is itself an aspect of his justice.
Precisely, Anselm is weaving a complex tapestry here, connecting these attributes in a way that maintains God's perfect nature. But as you pointed out earlier, he also recognizes that there are limits to human understanding. We can't fully grasp the infinite mind of God.
That's a humbling thought. Okay, so we've explored Anselm's theistic proofs and his ideas about the divine nature. What about his views on human freedom, sin, and redemption? Those were some of the big questions we teased at the beginning of our deep dive.
We can't leave those out. And as you might expect, Anselm's perspective on these topics is just as thought-provoking, especially for a philosopher.
Okay, my philosophical brain is ready. Let's dive in.
First, we need to unpack Anselm's unique definition of free will. He defines it as the power to preserve rectitude of will for its own sake.
Rectitude of will. That's a phrase that definitely needs some unpacking. What exactly did Anselm mean by that?
To understand rectitude of will, we need to go back to Anselm's work on truth. He had a very broad concept of truth that applied not just to statements, but also to things like the will actions, even the very essence of things. And in each case, truth for Anselm boils down to rectitude, which means being or doing what one ought to be or do according to one's nature and purpose.
So a true statement accurately reflects reality. A true action aligns with what's right and so on.
You got it. And when it comes to the will, rectitude means willing what one ought to will in accordance with the purpose for which the will was given. So a will is true or rectified when it's functioning properly, so to speak. It's aligned with its true purpose.
Okay, I'm following.
Yeah.
But how does this connect to freedom?
Well, remember how Anselm defines freedom as the power to preserve rectitude of will for its own sake? He's saying that true freedom is the ability to consistently choose what's right, not because of external pressures or rewards, but purely because it is right.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's not just about having choices, but about making the right choices for the right reasons. It's about the will being in alignment with what is true and good.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really intriguing. Anselm argues that even beings who can't sin are still free. God and the good angels, for example, can't do wrong, but they're still free because they can and do choose good for its own sake.
Wait, so he's saying that a being who can't sin is actually more free than one who can. How does that make sense?
It's a challenging idea, but it follows from his definition of freedom. For Anselm, the ability to choose wrongly represents a deficiency in the will, a departure from its true purpose. True freedom, in his view, is the ability to consistently and unwaveringly choose what is good.
That's a fascinating perspective. It certainly challenges our usual assumptions about free will.
It does, and it leads to some interesting implications for how Anselm understands sin and redemption, which we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, let's take a moment to process all of this and come back, ready to tackle the rest of Anselm's thought-provoking ideas. All right, so we're back, and last time we were wrestling with this idea that beings who can't sin are actually more free,
Right, more free.
according to Anselm.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Now we get to the tricky part. If free will is all about choosing good, like Anselm says, how did humans and those rebellious angels, how did they manage to sin
Yeah, how'd they screw it up?
in the first place?
It seems like a contradiction.
It does. It's like he set up this definition of freedom that kind of excludes the possibility of sinning at all.
Right.
So how does he explain that?
Well, Anselm's argument is subtle.
Okay.
He says that in order to preserve rectitude of will,
Okay.
to consistently choose good,
Uh,
you also need the ability to initiate your own actions.
Right.
It's not enough to just react to external forces or instincts.
right.
He calls this the power for self-initiated action.
So it's about having genuine agency,
Right.
the capacity to really be the author of your own choices,
Yeah,
rather than just a puppet, responding to strings.
exactly.
And that's where things went wrong for humans and the fallen angels.
That's where the fall happens.
They had this power of self-initiated action,
Uh-huh.
but they directed it towards the wrong goal.
Right.
Instead of aiming for justice and alignment with God's will, they chose to prioritize their own happiness,
Yeah.
even if it meant going against what was right.
Uh-huh.
Ah, I see. So it's not that they lacked free will,
Right.
but that they misused it.
They misused it.
They chose to elevate their own desires above what was truly good.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But then how do we get out of this mess?
Good question.
If we're all infected with this tendency to misuse our free will,
Right.
how can we ever get back to that rectitude of will
Uh-huh.
that Anselm was talking about?
This is where Anselm's concept of grace comes in.
Okay.
He believed that because of the fall, humans lost the ability to consistently choose good on their own.
We still have free will
Okay.
in the sense that if we had rectitude of will,
Okay.
we could preserve it,
Uh,
but we don't.
We don't.
So we're
right?
stuck. We need divine help.
So it's like our free will is damaged or maybe just incomplete.
Yeah.
And we need God's grace to restore it.
That's the idea.
Okay. And this leads into Anselm's famous work, Crudeus Homo,
Right.
where he argues that only a God-man,
Mm-hmm.
someone who is both fully divine
Fully divine
and fully human,
and fully human.
could bridge this gap between our brokenness and God's perfection.
That's right.
But like you said earlier,
Yeah.
that's a whole other deep dive.
Whole other conversation.
So let's bring it all together.
Yeah.
Anselm argued that God's existence can be logically demonstrated, that God possesses these extraordinary attributes like
Whoa.
timelessness and impassibility,
Yeah.
and that our free will is ultimately about choosing good,
Mm-hmm.
even though we often fail spectacularly at it.
And you know what's interesting is that despite the centuries that separate us from Anselm,
Uh-huh.
his ideas still resonate
They do.
with philosophers today.
Absolutely. He challenges us to think deeply
Yeah.
about the nature of God, the meaning of freedom, and that relationship between faith and reason.
It's clear that Anselm wasn't afraid to tackle the big questions.
Nope.
And he did it with rigor, passion,
Mm-hmm.
and just incredible intellectual ambition.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes him so compelling,
Yeah.
even for those who might disagree with his conclusions.
Right.
He pushes us to examine our own assumptions, to sharpen our arguments, and to keep searching
Yeah.
for those deeper truths.
To our listener,
Yes.
the philosophy enthusiast,
Uh-huh.
we leave you with these questions. Does Anselm's ontological argument convince you?
Mm-hmm.
If God is truly timeless,
Yeah.
how does that change your understanding of prayer and our relationship with the divine?
Right.
And finally, does Anselm's view of freedom with its emphasis on rectitude of will resonate with you?
Hmm.
Could a being who can't sin
Yeah.
truly be free?
Big questions.
These are questions worth pondering.
They are.
And as we've seen,
Yeah.
there are no easy answers.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It
Yeah.
invites us to engage in this ongoing conversation,
Right.
to grapple with the complexity, and to keep our minds open
Yeah.
to new possibilities.
Well said. And with that, we conclude our deep dive into the world of Anselm of Canterbury.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey,
Mm-hmm.
and we encourage you to continue exploring these fascinating questions on your own.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep.